What Works Clearinghouse, or the WWC, practice guides provide educators with evidence-based practices to tackle current challenges in education. Practice guides combine the best available evidence and expertise on a topic to give educators strategies to use in their classrooms and schools. Practice guides contain several recommendations on a topic with specific, practical steps to carry out each recommendation. Each recommendation is assigned a level of evidence that summarizes the rigorous research supporting it. Let's review the 3 possible levels of evidence and how they are determined. The 3 levels of evidence in WWC practice guides are strong, moderate, and minimal. These levels indicate the strength of the research evidence supporting the effectiveness of the recommended practices in improving student outcomes. In other words, following the WWC's systematic review of evidence relevant to the practice guide, the evidence level signals how confident the panel is that the recommended practice improves outcomes for students. The strong and moderate evidence level categories align directly with the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, tiered rating system. A recommendation receives a strong rating when there is consistent evidence that it meets WWC standards without reservations and indicates that the practices improve outcomes for a diverse student population. A practice that receives a strong evidence rating meets the Tier 1 ESSA rating criteria because it is supported by positive findings from well-designed and well-implemented experimental studies conducted in multiple sites and with large samples of students. A recommendation receives the moderate rating when there is some evidence that it meets WWC standards and indicates that the practices improve student outcomes, but it may be unclear whether that improvement is the direct result of the practices. It also may be unclear whether the findings can be replicated with a diverse population of students. A practice that receives a moderate evidence rating meets the Tier 2 ESSA rating criteria because it is equivalent to favorable evidence from well-designed and well-implemented quasi-experimental design studies conducted in multiple sites and with large samples of students. A recommendation receives a minimal rating when evidence does not meet WWC standards, is ineligible for WWC review, or exhibits weak or contradictory evidence of effects. The recommendation has been included in the guide because the panel members believe, based on their expert opinions as researchers and practitioners, that the practice is necessary to complement the guide's other practice recommendations. A practice that receives a minimal evidence rating may meet the Tier 4 ESSA rating criteria because there may be high-quality research that demonstrates the rationale for the practice to improve student outcomes. To determine the level of evidence, WWC certified reviewers assess all of the research related to each recommended practice in the guide. Then, the WWC works with a panel of nationally recognized experts and educators to assign a level of evidence to each recommendation. The panel considers several criteria when determining the level of evidence for a practice guide recommendation, including the size of the samples of individuals in the study supporting the recommended practices, and whether the studies were implemented in multiple sites. The extent to which the studies overlap with the range of student populations and school settings that are the focus of the practice guide. Whether the recommended practices were tested directly as the interventions in the relevant studies or were at least major components of the interventions. The extent to which the evidence supporting the recommendations meets WWC standards without reservations or with reservations when findings from studies are synthesized meta-analytically by the WWC. Whether the recommended practices led to statistically significant improvements in outcomes for at least half of the relevant outcome domains when the WWC synthesizes findings meta-analytically across studies. And whether the weighted mean effect size and its statistical significance from the fixed effect meta-analysis for each relevant outcome domain indicates any negative effects associated with the practice recommendation. To earn the highest evidence rating, studies supporting a recommendation must use high-quality, rigorous designs. The estimate of effects must come primarily from studies that meet WWC design standards without reservations. The studies meeting standards also must overlap with a range of student populations and school settings that are the focus of the practice guide. For example, did the studies assess the practice in different regions of the United States? Did the studies occur in multiple grades within the scope of the practice guide? was the practice assessed for students facing the same challenges as the student populations that are the focus of the practice guides? Based on these criteria, a practice guide recommendation sometimes may be assigned a minimal level of evidence. However, this does not mean that the practice guide panel is lukewarm about the recommendation, or that there is no research evidence or practitioner experience informing the recommendation. A recommendation with this level of evidence is based primarily on the expert opinion and consensus of the practice guide panel about the quality of the available evidence. The recommendation is included in the guide because it complements the other practice recommendations. The expert panel endorses all of the guide's recommendations, regardless of level of evidence, as a coherent set of practices to improve student outcomes. To highlight the differences in evidence levels, let's look at two WWC practice guides. In the Assisting Students Struggling with Mathematics Intervention in the Elementary Grades Practice Guide, the panel's recommendation provides systematic instruction during the intervention to develop student understanding of mathematical ideas, received an evidence rating of strong evidence. In this case, 43 studies contributed to the level of evidence on the effectiveness of systematic intervention design features and systematic instruction. The samples in these studies included more than 350 students across multiple districts and states and were aligned with the focus of the practice guide, which was students struggling with mathematics in kindergarten through 6th grade. In addition, the recommended practice was a major component of the intervention in these studies. 7 of the 11 outcome domains covered by these studies had statistically significant positive meta-analytic effect sizes, with more than 50% of the meta-analytic weight coming from studies that meet WWC standards without reservations. In the Designing and Delivering Career Pathways at Community Colleges Practice Guide, the panel's recommendation, intentionally design and structure career pathways to enable students to further their education, secure a job, and advance in their employment, received an evidence level rating of moderate evidence. In this case, 12 studies of interventions with career pathways components contributed to the level of evidence. The samples in these studies included more than 350 students across multiple states and were aligned with the focus of the guide, which was students enrolled in community colleges. In addition, the recommended practice was a major component of the intervention in these studies. Overall, there were findings in 5 outcome domains, 4 of which had statistically significant positive meta-analytic effects. However, the average effect sizes for the positive outcome domains are predominantly derived from studies that meet WWC group design standards with reservations, which is why the evidence level was rated as moderate evidence instead of strong evidence. By comparison, the panel's recommendation offer flexible instructional delivery schedules and models to improve credit accumulation and completion of non-degree credentials along career pathways, received an evidence level rating of minimal evidence. In this case, 6 studies of interventions with flexible instructional delivery models contributed to the level of evidence. 5 studies met WWC group design standards without reservations, and 1 study met WWC group design standards with reservations. Though there were findings in 5 outcome domains, significant positive effects were demonstrated in only 2 domains. Statistically significant findings were not found for the others. The rationale for each level of evidence rating is described in detail in the Practice Guide's appendix. You'll also find a full list of the studies providing evidence for each recommendation, along with basic information about each study, like the number of study participants, the setting, a description of the intervention and comparison conditions, and findings. The WWC is an investment of the Institute of Education Sciences, the independent research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. You can download our free practice guides from our website. For more information on the WWC, please visit whatworks.ed.gov.